Good morning. Welcome to the National D-Day Memorial for our lunchbox lecture today. This is an exciting one we have been looking forward to. It's my privilege to introduce Linda Hervieux, a friend of the National D-Day Memorial for some years. She appeared live here for a lecture in, I believe it was 2016, so it's been a few years since she's visited with us. But through the magic of the internet, she's with us today to speak on a very important topic, one we like to emphasize here at the National D-Day Memorial, and that is the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the only African-American unit to land on the beaches on D-Day. And for way of introduction, let me say that Linda is a journalist and photographer whose work has appeared all over the place as New York Times, International Herald Tribune, New York Daily News. She's written for the Paris Guide for Photos, many other publications, probably many more since this has been printed. She is from Lowell, Massachusetts originally, but now lives in Paris with her husband. And her book, Forgotten, the Untold Story of D-Day's Black Heroes at Home and at War, is a wonderful source. We refer to it all the time, and it's going to be the subject of her talk today. So, Linda, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Are you in Paris now?
Yes, I am. I'm 6 hours ahead of you. So.
Excellent. How's the weather there?
It's a little cold. Yeah.
Really?
But, yeah. But it's all right. It's all right. It's getting warmer. It's getting less gray and less dark. Yeah, Paris is gray and dark in the winter. So we're coming out of it. So it's good.
We have very fond memories of your visit with us a few years ago. And I believe you're going to tell us a little bit more about Mr. Dabney in your presentation. But I will just turn it over to you and let you tell us about the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion.
Thank you. Thanks to, again, to the National D-Day Memorial, to John and Tara and the team for inviting me to speak. As you heard, it's my second talk with the memorial. I was thrilled last time that Bill Dabney from Roanoke was with me. We've lost Bill. We've lost all of the men I interviewed for the book. And so, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about them. And I'm here to talk about the forgotten men of the African-American men of D-Day, but also I'll talk to you about a few other units too, also that I touch on in the book. D-Day was, of course, a very important chapter of our history, and this battalion was very special. I had the honor of researching them before this book came out in 2015. First of all, I'd like to just say I think we can all agree that history is important. We have memorials dedicated to our fallen heroes, to our veterans, the greatest generation of World War II. They're still very much on our minds, in our books, and on our movie screens. But, not all of them are. And that was one of the reasons I wrote this book after I found out about this unit. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. But many of these men and women also, who even those who were stars in their day, were forgotten. And so those are some of the stories that I'd like to tell. I hope you can see on your screen at home, my slides here. I'm going to be showing you some pictures also of them. You can see, we're starting here with my book cover. And start here in June 2009 with this view of Omaha Beach in Normandy. It was the 65th anniversary of D-Day, and the French government pulled out all the stops. They had a huge ceremony because, why 65 years? They really didn't think that many of our men who were there for D-Day would be still with us for the 70th anniversary. So 65th, American President Obama, Queen of England, lots of world leaders were there. And so was William Dabney from Roanoke, Virginia, Bill. They gave Bill the Legion of Honor. France's highest decoration for his service. They picked one American to honor, one veteran, one man to honor, and that was Bill. And here's Bill wearing his Legion of Honor medal in his backyard in Roanoke. Bill was a member of the 320th Anti-Aircraft Barrage Balloon Battalion, as you heard John say. It was the only African-American combat unit at D-Day. The men of the 320th were charged with an unusual mission. And this is the 320th on Omaha Beach. To raise a curtain of silvery balloons from the ground over 2 of the 5 invasion beaches, the American beaches, Omaha and Utah. At that time, the U.S. Army was segregated, so the 320th was an all-Black battalion. So what did that mean? Well, it meant that the enlisted men and some of the non-commissioned officers were men of color, but the top officers were always white. Bill received his Legion of Honor medal in Paris at Invalides, that temple to all things military in Paris, some of you may know. After the ceremony, Bill shook the hands of Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks. Bill had no idea who they were until his son Vinny told him. But he knew very well that there were no men of color storming Omaha Beach in their movie, Saving Private Ryan. All Black veterans know this. In fact, no movies about D-Day show Black soldiers in action. A few books about D-Day mentioned the 320th, or that there were nearly 2,000 African-American troops on the Normandy beaches by the end of that extraordinary day. The 320th was among 2 African-American units given a commendation by General Eisenhower for their service, yet we don't know about them. And why does that matter? Well, D-Day is one of the most important days of the 20th century. The Allied commanders knew that if they could get their troops onto those beaches and up and over those bluffs, it was only a matter of time until their troops would be moving through Berlin. And to exclude a significant portion of our population from that epic battle does our country a tremendous disservice. The great General Omar Bradley said that all men who landed on Omaha Beach were heroes, yet there were heroes among the heroes. As I began research into my book, I learned that one of the men of the 320th, a college student, would become a star in Black America and beyond for his service on Omaha Beach. He would be nominated for the Medal of Honor. He would not get it. None of the 1 million African Americans who served in World War II received America's highest honor until 1997, when President Clinton awarded 7 of them. Those awards came after an independent study commissioned by the Army found that pervasive racism within the ranks denied deserving Black soldiers the decorations they deserved and the opportunities they deserved. So I'd like to tell you about that 320th soldier. His name was Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. Waverly Woodson's story is extraordinary, but it began with a simple case of beating the odds. Odds were low that a Black soldier would even be in the Normandy landings, but Woodson was used to defying expectations. Unlike some of his friends in West Philadelphia, Woodson didn't wait for a draft notice. He enlisted in the Army in December of 1942. At that time, there were 2 armies in America in World War II, Black and white. There were 2 of most things: barracks, mess halls, service clubs. Buses, train cars, and berth on ships were divided by race. It was a highly inefficient and extremely expensive way to run an army. Yet there was one sector that was integrated: officer candidate school. The Army didn't think that Black men were smart enough to score high enough on the entrance exam, an exam heavily favor whites, so they didn't bother to set up a separate system. But Woodson passed the test and trained as an anti-aircraft artillery officer. In the end, there were no positions available to him. This was a common story for Black officers whose service was limited by quotas and the rule that they not lead white officers junior to them. So then Corporal Waverly Woodson, who would rise to be a sergeant, was assigned to retrain as a medic with the 320th. And that is how Woodson, 21 years old, found himself in the early morning of June 6, 1944, aboard a boat slicing through the rough seas, heading to Omaha Beach. He nearly didn't make it. A shell hit near his boat, sending shards of burning shrapnel raining on deck. Woodson's lower extremities burned. He reached down and pulled up a hand covered in blood. "I am dying," he thought. Another medic patched him up, and then Woodson got to work treating the injured men around him. And that's what Waverly Woodson would do for the next 30 hours before he collapsed from exhaustion and his own injuries. He saved drowning men, he patched gaping wounds, extracted bullets, and dispensed blood plasma. He amputated a right foot. We know that Waverly Woodson was nominated for the Medal of Honor. There is a sole piece of paper at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, that proves this. It says, "Here is a Negro from Philadelphia who was recommended for a suitable award." And it was written by an aide in the War Department to an aide in the White House. There is no trace of the records that explain what happened to Waverly Woodson's medals, and that is not unusual. Only 1% of Army records from World War II exist today. What's notable about this one, I think, is also that our correspondents wrote, "This is a big enough award that the president can give it personally, as he has in the case of some white boys." So it's pretty clear from the Philadelphia, and it's pretty clear from this, that we're speaking about Waverly Woodson. But to the Army, this note is hearsay. It's not part of an official record. But there's further proof of Woodson's actions, and I'll just show you a sample here. These are the Woodson family photo albums. There are a lot of them. Why? Because in the summer of 1944, Waverly Woodson was a huge star. Newspapermen came to interview him, and Woodson returned home a celebrity. The crusading black press hailed him as #1 invasion hero and began calling on the White House to award him the Medal of Honor. Significantly, stapled to the note in the Truman Library is a press release issued by the Army on August 28, 1944, detailing Woodson's heroism. That the Army would praise the individual actions of a black soldier on Omaha Beach was nothing short of extraordinary. For the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the French government chose a trio of Americans to honor. They flew them to France and presented them with a palm-sized medal commemorating their service in Normandy. They included Waverly Woodson, 72 years old, and his wife, Joanne. Waverly Woodson died on August 12, 2005. His grave is in Arlington National Cemetery, where we Americans bury our heroes. In June 2015, President Obama awarded the Medal of Honor to a black soldier from World War I named Henry Johnson. This is Sergeant Johnson wearing his French Croix de Guerre medal. Sergeant Johnson was a member of the legendary Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry from New York. Johnson single-handedly fought off a German raiding party that attacked the trench he was guarding, using up all of his weapons until all that he had left was his bolo knife. Like Woodson, Johnson's heroics made him a star. Yet Johnson died 11 years after the war in poverty, without even a Purple Heart for his injuries, and therefore no medical benefits at that time to treat those wartime injuries. 8 decades later, at that ceremony at the White House, President Obama said, "It is never too late to say thank you." In 1941, the men of the 320th began receiving their draft notices. One of those men was a 21-year-old in Atlantic City named Wilson Caldwell Monk. And here's Wilson with a Barrage balloon. At that time, America was not at war, so Wilson Monk expected a 1-year commitment. He was in for a surprise, and an even bigger surprise when he boarded a train car and headed south to his first Army training camp. Somewhere north of Washington, D.C., Monk was told he had to switch to the Negro car. He had no idea what that meant. The Negro car was always hauled by the noisy, dirty coal engine, so a soldier in uniform would arrive wherever he was going, covered in soot. The train south was the first taste of Jim Crow for the North's black recruits, who would arrive at their first day of boot camp already fuming. Wilson Monk was stationed at Camp Tyson, an Army base in northwestern Tennessee, built for the purpose of teaching men to fly barrage balloons. Of the 30 or so units that trained at Tyson, 4 battalions were black, and you can see in this photo the large size barrage balloons. These balloons were enormous. They were like the size of a couple school buses, and they typically took a crew of about 12 men to fly. We saw these balloons up and down the coast. Typically, after Pearl Harbor, they started flying from San Diego all up the coast, the West Coast, up to the Canadian border. They were also flying at certain installations on the East Coast. The balloons that went to war were smaller. And as you see, they're flown from the ground. Basically, a steel wire, like a piano wire, is attached to a winch. The men who learned to fly them learned how to make hydrogen to fill them with. They learned meteorological conditions, and it was quite tough flying these balloons. The ones that went to war were, Bill Dabney said, about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, and they required a crew of 3 men to fly. Here is Sam Madison in 2010, a few months before we lost Sam. He's from Columbus, Ohio, and he described his treatment at Camp Tyson and Paris, Tennessee, where it was located, as like being like a little dog. We were like little dogs, he said. One day in the spring of 1944, Wilson Monk and some friends boarded a train car and headed to Memphis on a weekend pass. They were really excited to see Memphis, hear the music on Beale Street, and just blow off some steam. Their first stop was at a diner where Monk asked for change to play the jukebox. The man behind the counter threw a handful of nickels back at him and told Monk, "If he wasn't in uniform, you wouldn't get a damn thing from me." What Monk learned was that wearing the uniform of the United States Army usually posed a problem for black soldiers among Southern whites, who saw a proud display of patriotism by a black man as a provocation. And it only got worse. Later, Monk and his friends went looking for a place to grab a bite. Outside one restaurant, they watched, incredulous, as a long line of German prisoners of war filed inside. Black men were not welcome there. There were 425,000 German and Italian prisoners of war interned in the U.S. during World War II, most of them at Army bases in the South, where they enjoyed privileges not accorded to the black soldiers who were also there. The fact that these enemy prisoners enjoyed often backslapping treatment by their white guards was extremely painful to soldiers like Wilson Monk, who, even 7 decades after the war, spoke about it to me with fresh hurt. Despite that hurt and despite the vicious treatment they endured, Monk and his fellow soldiers served our country with distinction, and they were not alone. This is Doris Miller. Dory was the first hero of World War II. The Navy initially did not want to recognize him and suppressed the story of his heroism at Pearl Harbor. As the Japanese sneak attack got underway, Miller, a cook aboard the USS West Virginia, jumped behind an anti-aircraft artillery gun and began firing. He took out a few Japanese planes with a gun he had never been trained to use. 15 men were awarded the Medal of Honor for their service on December 7, 1941, including the mortally wounded commander of the ship, whom Miller had dragged to safety. But not Miller, he got the Navy Cross, which at that time was 3rd place. The Navy did feature Miller in a 1943 recruiting poster, but he was never promoted. He was still working as a cook aboard the carrier Lycombe Bay in November 1943 when the ship was struck by a Japanese torpedo and sunk. Of the 900 men aboard, 272 survived, but not Doris Miller. One interesting fact that pertains to the 320th about Pearl Harbor is a Japanese spy who had been informing from the bluffs overlooking Pearl Harbor in the weeks and days ahead of the sneak attack told his Japanese handlers that there had been no barrage balloons flying at Pearl Harbor. And it is believed, had there been, wouldn't have been a Pearl Harbor. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, fought in 5 countries and captured 30 towns. The 183 days they served in combat was more than any other unit. Their commander, General George S. Patton Jr., made it clear what was expected to them. Everyone has their eyes on you, Patton told them, most of all your race. Don't let them down. The Panthers won many decorations, including 11 Silver Stars, but they would have to wait until 1978 for their Distinguished Unit citation given to them by President Jimmy Carter. America's first Black pilots of the 332nd Fighter Group and the 99th Fighter Squadron, of course, the Tuskegee Airmen, spent the war treated like pariahs, as one of them put it. Denied proper training and ignored by their commanders, they went on to fly more than 15,000 individual sorties. The bomber pilots, escorted by their red-tailed planes, had no idea the men who led them to safety were Black. Today, the Tuskegee Airmen are well known, but it wasn't until a TV movie aired in 1995 that brought their story back into our popular consciousness. The 92nd Infantry Division, with heroic roots dating back to the 19th century Buffalo Soldiers, were vilified during World War II. They were called incompetent and cowardly, yet their record reveals otherwise. In July 44, one of their regiments, the 366, was sent to mount a high-stakes frontal attack on seasoned German troops in Italy. They had only a few days' training in inferior weapons. Their commander, General Edward Ullman, who you see here, had greeted their arrival with these words: "I did not send for you. Your Negro newspapers, Negro politicians, and white friends have insisted on you seeing combat, and I shall see that you get combat in your share of the casualties." And so, despite suffering 3,000 casualties, and despite a system that shortchanged Black soldiers, the men of the 92nd collected scores of decorations, including 208 Silver Stars and 1,000 Bronze Stars. After Germany's surprise attack in the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium left 80,000 Americans killed, wounded, or captured, more than 2,000 Black service troops answered an urgent call for volunteer riflemen. Many of them were in labor and service units that Black soldiers were relegated to during the war in disproportionate numbers, and they took demotions for the chance to fight. They impressed their white commanders with their ferocity and drive. Although assigned to segregated platoons, they were the first men of color to fight shoulder to shoulder with white men since the Revolutionary War. One general told them, "I have never seen any soldiers who performed better in combat than you." Yet many men wouldn't see their medals that were due them until years after the war. 2 New York vets waited until the year 2000 for their Bronze Stars. There are many, many stories like this. African Americans served with distinction wherever they were assigned. And not just Black men, more than 4,000 women of color served their country with distinction. African American women served in the Red Cross and the Women's Army Corps. They worked as nurses and clerks, and some 800 of them were sent overseas to deliver tons of backed up mail to 7 million American soldiers. They were the 688s, the first battalion of Black women and the only female battalion to serve in Europe. And lest you think sorting tons of backlogged mail was an easy job, the women of the 688s would have set you straight. They worked in shifts round the clock, 7 days a week, while billeted in an old school in Birmingham, England, with cold showers, beds on the floor, and a request by the American commanders that they, because they were Black, not be allowed to use the community pool. They endured the same indignities as their male counterparts, Black male counterparts, with a mighty dose of sexism to boot. They were curiosities, oddities to white male soldiers who came to stare at them. The first time they marched through the streets of Birmingham in their crisp uniforms, cream-colored gloves, and berets they called hobby hats, they were nervous. Back home, it was only derision they experienced, but to the English, they were VIPs. The applause and even the whistles they got brought tears to their eyes. They thought we were beautiful, said Gladys Thomas Anderson, a private first class. We were treated better in Europe than in the States. Later, Thomas and her battalion mates were barred from that local swimming pool, but because of all the support they got locally, they found other things to do, and they returned home very, very happy about their service in Europe. On the subject of decorations, back to the 320th of the D-Day veterans I interviewed, Bill Dabney was not the only one to receive the Legion of Honor in France. Henry Parham of Pittsburgh got one too at the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. in June 2013. Henry called his service on Omaha Beach a privilege, even though he said we were treated like second-class citizens. We lost Henry on Independence Day last year, 2021. He was the last of the men whom I interviewed for my book to be with us. And this is Henry and his wife, Ethel. I'd like to close by telling you a story of hope that's perhaps instructive in our day, a time of great division, with protests, with debates on how to educate our students about history. It's interesting to note that the African Americans of World War II, who were marginalized and vilified in many corners of their own land, were treated abroad. After leaving Tennessee, the men of the 320th boarded train cars and headed for New York, where they trudged aboard the Acatania, a luxury ocean liner converted into a troop carrier. It was one of the 3 fastest ships in the world, packed with thousands of young Americans and Canadians. They docked in Scotland in November 1943, and for the next 7 months in the villages of England and Wales, they would enjoy liberties that they had never thought possible. In this land, white people were happy to meet them, share their meager war rations, and forge lasting friendships. In Britain, Black servicemen and women were Americans first, with funny accents and bright, white, bewildering smiles. In a nation made gray by the drudgery of war, their presence was incandescent. It was like Hollywood came to town, a man in Wales named Ken Clark told me. Ken was a boy when one day the Black GIs arrived, and he has never forgotten them. The importance of these experiences abroad for hundreds of thousands of Black GIs cannot be overemphasized. It was epic. It was through their time abroad in Europe, in the Pacific, even in occupied Germany, that African Americans like Wilson Monk, Waverly Woodson, Henry Parham, and Bill Dabney learned that race hatred was not a natural state of affairs. These wartime experiences abroad would help shape the budding American civil rights movement that would rock our country in the decades to come. Before leaving for Normandy, our man from Atlantic City, Sergeant Wilson Monk, was billeted in the hall of a stately stone church called Trinity Methodist in the village of Abersocken in southern Wales. One day he asked the church organist if he and his friends might attend Sunday services. "Well, of course you can," said the organist, Jeffrey Pryor. Pryor had no idea that back home, none of these men would have stepped foot in a white church. Then Jeffrey Pryor did the homesick GI one better. He introduced him to his wife, Jessie. The Pryor's 18-year-old son, Keith, was off fighting with the British forces, and Wilson Monk became their surrogate son. Like most Britons, the Pryors had never met a person of color until the Americans came, and they in turn were the first white people whom Wilson Monk had ever called his friends. And so an extraordinary correspondence began between Jessie Pryor and Wilson Monk's mother, Rosita, in Atlantic City. And about 10-minute walk from this church through the park. It still looks as it did today, as it did back in 1944. Wilson Monk, and usually a friend, would come for Sunday lunch at the Priors. And if you happen to find yourself in southern Wales, there's also a plaque on this church now, which was put there by the BBC, commemorating the African-American soldiers who were billeted there. I'll close by sharing one of the letters, and there are many more in my book that you can read, well, a few, from Jesse. Prior to Rosita Monk, we only have one-way correspondence on these letters. This is my favorite one. And Jesse writes to Rosita in Atlantic City, "My dear Mrs. Monk, how are you? I expect you will be very surprised receiving this letter from me. I feel I must write you and tell you how very delighted we are meeting Wilson and having him in our home. Mrs. Monk, you have a son to treasure and feel very proud of. We love him very dearly and will do anything in the world for him. All that we regret is we cannot have him home more, as duties won't allow. He does come as often as possible. We have told him he can look upon our home as his home while in our country, and I will try to fill your place, if only in a small way. But don't worry too much about him while he is here. We shall take every care of him. If ever he is ill or in any way wanting us, we shall be there. We look upon him now as our own, mother to mother, very sincerely with loving thoughts, Jesse Pryor." Wilson Monk and his war bride Martina were married for 60 years. One last note about Waverly Woodson. A bipartisan coalition of senators and congressmen led by Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland has introduced bills in the Senate and the House to award the Medal of Honor to Waverly Woodson. If you support this action, please consider asking your representatives and senators to support it. The homepage on my website links to a petition started by the Woodson family. You can see the link right here in this picture. You could add your name to it with a couple of clicks if you feel inclined. And you know, there's so much more I could tell you about the 320th, about these men. But if you have any questions, I am very, very happy to answer them. So thank you for listening to that, and I welcome any and all questions from you.
Excellent, Linda. Thank you very much. That's a great presentation. Always a fascinating story, and an important one because the history of race relations in World War II is just a fascinating topic, and one that a lot of people never think about, and yet it was very significant. I've often told my own students that it was service of African Americans in World War II that fed a lot of the civil rights movements after the war.
Mm-hmm.
And
absolutely,
they were right in there as well. We have had a few questions and comments come through, but one was, how did you get interested in this subject? How did you start on this book?
I started on this book because I was looking for an interesting story to write about for the big D-Day anniversary, the 65th anniversary. And I was looking around for something, and the French government made it easy by honoring Bill Dabney from Roanoke. So I met Bill, and I wrote about Bill. I had no idea that the American Army was segregated in World War II. A lot of the other American reporters didn't know that either. I mean, none of us knew about those balloons. We were just like, what are these balloons? You know, we had balloons, had no idea. Bill explained how the balloons work, which I have in a graphic in my book. I can show it to you also if you'd like to see it. The balloons, had these small bombs that went to war. The ones that went, not those huge ones you saw, but the ones that went to war had these small little bomblets on them. These were British designed balloons. And the bomb, a strike, if a plane hit the cable, it would get snagged, and it could crash. It could stall and crash. The balloons that went to war had this secret punch. The bomb that would descend on a little parachute system could blow a wing gas tank if it got a good hit. And Bill explained all this to us, and we were just fascinated. We had never heard such things. We had never heard about balloons. And so we reporters wrote about Bill, and I wrote about him for the New York Daily News, which was the paper I had been working at before I moved to France. And it seemed a shame to just do one story on Bill and his battalion. They had told us at the time that Bill was the last one left from the unit. It turns out nobody checked, nobody who was organizing the event, or us reporters who were writing on deadline, nobody saw anything else about men from this battalion. So we wrote that Bill was the last one, but I thought that was a shame. So I started looking more into it. I was kind of thinking of maybe a specialty magazine piece, or something. And a friend of mine said, that's a book. And I thought, well, I don't know if it's a book. How do you know it's a book? I've never written a book. And he said, no, it's a book. I'm sure it's a book. And I spoke to an agent who had sold a book on the Harlem Hellfighters who said, yeah, that's a book. And so with that, that's a book. I started looking for more men, and I happily had the retired librarian from the New York Daily News helping me. We were able to use their databases to find other men. They let us use whatever they had available that wasn't a charge. And so we found a total of 12 men who could give interviews and the families of many others. And that led to the book. It would take 5 years for the book, not all full time, about 2 years of that full time. And through those years, I would travel on a circuit as I would find the men from Washington, D.C. First, it was just direct to Roanoke. Then it was to Clarksburg, Maryland, to speak to the widow of Waverly Woodson. Then Pittsburgh to Henry Parham. Then Columbus, Ohio for Sam Madison. Then the Carolinas. And eventually, I was able to meet all of the men in person. The 12 of them, and I spoke to many other families. And that's, in a nutshell, how that happened.
And your friends were right. It's a book. There it is. Is it a movie?
We're hoping. Yeah, we're hoping. Yeah, there's the book's been under option by a team. And we'll see what, but a lot of authors option their books, and we don't see screen treatment. So we'll see. Fingers crossed that they can bring it to the screen. I think it's an interesting story. I think if you read the book, you don't have to read it in order either, because every chapter is self-contained. So I think there are several really interesting parts that would support a screen treatment, especially the time these men spent in Britain, which is really fascinating to me. So, in a much of a contrast from their Southern training camp, which was, some of the men were scared to even leave that camp because they were scared of the treatment they would get on the outside.
Another question came in just, I think, just before you answered this in your talk, but are there any veterans still living from the 320th?
Not that I know of. I was able to find 12, and when we lost Henry Parham last July 4th, that was the last. He was the last one. I can't say for sure that there weren't any more than those 12, but I looked quite hard to find them, and I found 12. And after the book came out, I've been speaking about the book constantly since 2015, regularly. I do Zooms like this, and I've written quite a few articles adapted for Time Magazine and the Daily Beast and NBC News. And every time they would get some publicity like that, I'd be contacted by people from families who had men, grandfathers and grandfathers and uncles in the battalion, but I haven't had any new men come to me since, probably for a couple years now. So I don't think there's any more. No. And remember too, Bill Dabney from Roanoke was the baby of the battalion. He was not old enough to enlist, but his grandmother agreed to sign a paper saying he was of age, and he was able to enlist. He didn't want to be the only one home when all his friends were going off. So Bill Dabney was the baby, and he was 89 when I met him. So that just gives you a sense.
A wonderful man. I enjoyed getting to know this.
He's wonderful. Wasn't he just a hit in Bedford? Bill is the best storyteller, the happiest guy. He would tell me these terrible stories with a smile on his face, because Bill's attitude was, you do the best you can to get by in this life, and he was really, really wonderful. And it wasn't just Bill. Cecil, his friend Cecil Cooper from Roanoke, also was in another Black Barrage balloon battalion, and his was not, only the 320th was sent to war, so he was not sent off. But they just told me stories about, they both grew up in Roanoke, and about the war. They became friends at Camp Tyson, and they stayed friends for life. So
excellent. Did the 320th veterans have any reunions over the years?
No. And in fact, they did not keep in touch. And, it's interesting because there really was nothing organized. This wasn't a battalion. This was a battalion formed, and attached to, larger units for this campaign. And they did not have sort of the organized structure that a lot of, the more established, battalions and infantry divisions have. And Wilson, they each individually kept in touch with their friends. For years, Wilson Monk would get together with his pals. He was in the headquarters battalion, they were basically the bosses, the inspectors. They inspected the balloons. They made sure for safety and things like this, where Bill was a member of Battery B on Omaha Beach, and B. C was A and B were on Omaha. C was on Utah, and Bill kept in touch with a couple people too. But then eventually, those ties, as these men got older, these ties frayed. And so, when I finally reached out to them, only Wilson Monk had a few letters to show me with some of his friends' names. Wilson Monk also had, though, this was interesting, and I have a picture of it in the book. He had a canister of a German gas tank inside, and one of the men in the unit had been a painter, and in yellow script he wrote all the names of the members of the headquarters battery around the gas tank. So that actually helped me a great deal. I had all these names because of that gas mask container. So
excellent. How many men from the 320th were killed on D-Day?
We have at Omaha Beach, we have three men are buried. 3 men were killed on D-Day. John, I should know this off the top of my head, right? 3 men were killed on D-Day. 4 died in Normandy. 1 died later. 3 are buried in Normandy. And one, his body was brought back to the U.S. Just verifying that as I talk to you. It's so funny, I've never been asked that question, and so I wrote it, but I haven't thought about it. No, there are 3 graves, and I believe 3 were killed on D-Day, and one died later.
I believe you're right. We have our wall, which lists all the names of every Allied man we know died on D-Day, and I'm pretty sure there are 3 from the 320th, and then 2 other African Americans from quartermaster units. So as far as we know, of 5 African Americans who died on D-Day.
Yeah, and on my website, which I'm calling up now to get you to get you that. I have at the top a button for the 320th, which are pictures of all the men. And if you click them, you can read their bios. And those also include men that I found later because family members contacted me. So yeah, we have 3 buried in Normandy. And 2 of them were on June 6th. The other died later. And then there was another man who's not buried there who was killed on D-Day. So.
Excellent. And Paul made a comment that since these veterans are gone, it'd be great to see interviews recalled by their children. And that might be an interesting study. We have an oral history in our archive of Bill Dabney.
Yeah.
It's not high quality video or audio, but at least record some of his story.
You know, if
another
anyone...
question, a little bit on the technical side.
Mm-hmm.
What gas was in the barrage balloons? Was it helium or hydrogen?
Hydrogen. Yeah, hydrogen. There was not, as some of you know, helium is naturally producing, and it's a safe gas. It's and it's produced still. Most of the world's supply is in the Texas Panhandle, around that part of the country, and there was not enough of that gas to power these craft and these aircraft in World War II. Meaning the Zeppelins, the piloted, those giant blimps that the Navy had. That's why we had a Hindenburg explosion, because those craft had to be filled with hydrogen. I'm glad somebody asked this, because hydrogen is easy to produce. Actually, it turns out it's just it's a simple formula, apparently. And so these men learned how to make hydrogen so that they could make it on the beaches. And also, the first time these balloons were tested was in the Italian campaign in the fall of 1943. And those units, there were 3 white barrage balloon battalions that landed in Italy, and they were so successful that they decided that a battalion would be going to Normandy. And they tested this hydrogen, making hydrogen. And I was able to find information about that from those records. The Americans in Normandy were aided by the Royal Air Force, because a lot of balloons were filled in England before they came across the channel. And the British had a big supply of hydrogen. But as we know from the Hindenburg, hydrogen's dangerous, so it was very dangerous to deal with hydrogen. And so there were some accidents at Camp Tyson, but not in Normandy with hydrogen.
I suppose having your barrage balloon extra explosive could be an advantage.
Yeah, not if you're the men flying them. However, it was very dangerous for them. That's why they really had to know weather conditions. Some of those balloons got away in storms in training in Camp Tyson. Men were killed, at least one at the camp. It was very dangerous. These runaway balloons were like rolling bombs. And so, and remember what I showed you, those balloons in the Camp Tyson video, they were enormous. The big ones, those were the ones that flew over Navy installations along the coasts as protection. Those are the types of balloons that would have been flying over Pearl Harbor to protect the Navy base that day.
Paul also asked if the fact that hydrogen was so dangerous, was that one of the reasons behind African Americans getting that assignment?
I've been asked that question. No, ironically, because later, right, there was that accusation in Vietnam and some other campaigns that soldiers of color were being used as cannon fodder. This was not the case in World War II. You have to remember, in World War II, the vast majority of Black troops were relegated to labor and service battalions deliberately. And Army literature, everything, Army studies, in order to support that, dehumanized them, said that they were cowardly, said that they had smaller brains, said that they were more suited to take orders than to give them. There was a whole, and I write about this in the book. And the reason that's important is these men had to fight for the right to fight. They had to fight for the right to fight. And they had friends in Congress. Eleanor Roosevelt was a friend of the Black soldier. Why an African-American battalion was picked of the 30 at Camp Tyson to go to what ended up being an epic battle in the war, we don't know. I have theories. I think that they were perhaps chosen because there was a lot of pressure on the Roosevelt White House to give soldiers of color more responsibility. And so we saw later in the war, the Tuskegee Airmen. We saw other battalions. The Navy eventually opened up. The Navy, when the Army was taking in Black recruits, the Navy still did not have. They only had, messmen. They only had servants. Marines had no Black soldiers. Later in the war, the Navy opened up sooner than the Army did. Why did these men go to Normandy? I think it's a good bet that there was pressure to give Black men more responsibility, and perhaps that was why this specialty unit was picked. Remember also, when they landed on Omaha and Utah beaches, they were infantry soldiers. They did not get those balloons up until the small arms fire was clear. They came in with the infantry. They came in on landing crafts in groups of 3 with the infantry. And for all intents and purposes, they were infantry soldiers.
And one last question. Overall, how effective were the barrage balloons on D-Day?
The barrage balloons were effective. The job of the barrage balloons was, these men, their job was to stay on the beach. So these balloons formed a curtain protecting the men and the materiel, the shipping. And so long after the troops and supply troops and everyone left the beach, these men were staying there. They also went to liberate the ports along the coast. One variable at D-Day was how strong the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was going to be. And as we know now, the Luftwaffe was depleted, but they rallied and they bombed those beaches, and they, for quite some time after D-Day. And this unit is believed to have taken out a couple of planes with the balloons. How many they deterred, we don't know. One thing we do know is that the Germans were terrified of these balloons. Pilots were terrified of these balloons. Nobody wanted to tangle with balloons. They would hover in the clouds at 2,000 feet. And, it wasn't until we had the V-2 rocket that could slice through their cables that they were no longer a threat. But one thing that's interesting about the barrage balloons is they're still with us. They never went away. So they are still used. They were used in Iraq and Afghanistan with sensors on them for various gases. They're used on the border with Mexico with cameras and sensors. And so they've never really gone away.
Interesting. And I've often said, I think they were more deterrent than actual weapons, but
yeah, they are. They're right. And we know that they're effective. So if they were flying over London in the Blitz, that was too large an area for a barrage balloon to protect. But when they were flying over individual British plants, those plants were not attacked most of the time because pilots were very scared of them. They were very, very scared of them. If you got snagged by that cable, you would stall. And so they would just find another target. So they were quite effective. And it was determined that a beach was a perfect area to protect. And they were so successful in the Italian campaign. And I talk about that in the book. They were so successful in the Italian campaign that that's why they were picked for Normandy.
Excellent. Well, we are about out of time, so I want to thank you, Linda, for a fascinating talk, very relevant and important one. And when are you coming back to Virginia?
Oh, I'd love to come back. God, when we're traveling again and doing whatever we want, I'd love to come back.
Absolutely. We will certainly take you back. So we look forward to that day. But for now, again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to all who've been watching. And we'll watch this after the fact. And also remind you, of course, now as spring is springing in Virginia, it's a great time to visit the National D-Day Memorial. So, Linda, thank you. And we hope we will see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us.